Listen, if you think you've seen a crowd lose its mind, you haven't heard about the island of Salamis in 479 BC. There was this local councillor named Lycidas. He stood up in front of a packed assembly and basically said, "Hey, maybe we should just hear out the Persian peace offer." Bad move. The crowd didn't even stop to boo or argue. They surrounded him and stoned him to death right there on the floor of the debate hall, but it gets even darker. The women of Athens heard the commotion, ran to the guy's house, dragged his wife and children into the street, and did the exact same thing to them. That is the level of raw, unfiltered hatred we are talking about. This wasn't some movie. This was the brutal reality for people who were tired of diplomacy. The Greeks were done talking. Their homes were ashes. Their heroes from the 300 Spartans were dead, and they were looking for blood. They weren't looking to be victims anymore. They were ready to become butchers. The Persians weren't exactly packing up and leaving either. King Xerxes had headed home, but the threat stayed behind. He left his top shark, General Mardonius, to finish the job. Now you have to understand, Mardonius wasn't some tourist. He was way more dangerous than the king himself. This guy was sitting in the plains of Boeotia with 300,000 of the most dangerous professional killers the empire had, effectively holding a knife to the throat of all of Greece. To show he wasn't playing around, he burned Athens to the ground a second time just to prove a point, basically saying, "I am still here." The Athenians, who were basically living as refugees on the islands at this point, had reached their absolute breaking point. They sent runners down to Sparta with a message, but they didn't go there to beg for help. It was a straight-up threat. They told the Spartan leaders, "If you guys don't march your army north right now, the Athenian navy is joining the Persians, and when that happens, those big walls of yours won't save you." The Spartans had been dragging their feet for a while, hiding behind the Isthmus of Corinth and hoping the whole Persian problem would just blow over while they stayed safe. But the prospect of a Persian-Athenian alliance finally lit a fire under their backsides and kicked the Spartan war machine into high gear. And trust me, when Sparta decides to move, the ground actually shakes. In a single night, the leaders issued a mobilization order that was absolutely insane. They didn't just send a small group of guys as a scout force, they emptied the entire city. Here is the logistical detail that really shows they meant business. They brought the slaves. For every single elite Spartan knight, they armed and marched 7 helot slaves. That is 35,000 conscripted servants walking side by side with their masters to war. Toss in another 5,000 provincial troops, and you have a massive column of 45,000 men that just vanished from the region before the sun even came up. The next morning, when the Athenian messengers woke up ready to scream at the Spartan leaders again, the leaders just checked the sun and told them to stop shouting. They said, "The army is already at the border. The hunt has officially begun." While the Spartans were marching north, kicking up massive clouds of dust and scaring everyone in their path, General Mardonius was already making his move. Now, we need to clear something up. In movies, the Persians are often shown as a mindless swarm driven by whips, but that is just pure propaganda. The army Mardonius kept in Greece was nothing like the bloated parade force Xerxes had brought. Mardonius had trimmed all the fat and sent the weak ones home. What remained was a lean, mean, professional killing machine of 300,000 men. These were the Immortals, the heavy infantry who had actually broken the Spartan line at Thermopylae. These were the Saka horse archers who could put an arrow through a tiny gap in your armor while riding at a full gallop. Mardonius wasn't counting on just having more guys. He was counting on speed and being tactical. When his scouts reported that the Spartans had finally left their homes, Mardonius didn't panic. He actually smiled. This was exactly what he wanted. He knew he couldn't fight those heavy Greek shields in the narrow streets of a city like Athens. That would be suicide. He needed wide open room to move his horses. So, he gave the order to leave Athens, but not before delivering one last insult. He ordered the entire city to be razed to the ground. Anything that was still standing, walls, houses, even the temples, was pulled down or burned. He turned the city into a graveyard of broken stones, leaving the Greeks with nothing to come back to but ashes. It was a scorched earth policy designed to break their hearts before the actual battle even started. Mardonius then pulled his forces north into a place called Boeotia near the city of Thebes. This wasn't a retreat, it was a total trap. He chose his ground like a professional chess player. He set up his camp along the Asopus River in the flat, open plains of Plataea. Why there? Because the Greek fighting style had one massive flaw. They were slow. Their shield wall was an unstoppable force of bronze, but it turned as slowly as a giant battleship. On flat ground, the Persian cavalry could just dance circles around them, hitting them with arrows from the sides until they broke. He even built a massive fortified base, a square mile of wooden walls and towers, creating a secure center for his operations. He basically built a city of war in the middle of a field and just sat back, waiting for the Greeks to walk right into the slaughterhouse. And honestly, they almost did exactly that. The allied Greek army, now growing with reinforcements from every city that hadn't surrendered to Persia, finally arrived at the edge of the plain. They looked down from the hills and saw an ocean of Persian tents. They saw the glittering armor of the Immortals and thousands of horses grazing by the river. The Greek commanders, led by the Spartan regent Pausanias, did the only smart thing they could do. They stopped. They refused to go down onto that flat ground. They stayed on the rocky slopes where the horses couldn't reach them, and it turned into a high-stakes staring contest. Mardonius was down in the valley, and Pausanias was up on the ridge. Days passed, and Mardonius started getting bored. He didn't stay in Greece just to look at Spartans, he stayed to kill them. So he decided to test their nerves. He didn't send his foot soldiers, he sent his best cavalry commander, a guy named Mecistius. Now this guy Mecistius was a legend in the Persian army, a giant of a man riding a massive horse with a bridle made of solid gold. He led his riders right up the slopes to mess with the Greek lines. They rode in circles, yelling and raining arrows down on the Greeks. They even called the Spartans women for hiding in the hills. It was humiliating, and the Greeks were taking hits without being able to fight back against those hit-and-run tactics. One group of Greek allies, the Megarians, were getting pinned down so hard they were about to run away. They sent a desperate message to the Spartan general. "Send help, or we are leaving." Pausanias looked around at his other commanders. Who was going to volunteer to go down and fight horses on open ground? It was basically a suicide mission. But then 300 Athenians stepped forward, almost like an echo of those 300 Spartans from before. They rushed down to help, bringing their own archers, and in the middle of all that chaos, luck finally showed up. An arrow hit Mecistius's horse in the side. The animal reared up and threw the Persian commander into the dirt. The moment he hit the ground, the Athenians swarmed him like a pack of wolves. But here is the crazy part. They couldn't kill him. Mecistius was wearing a suit of scale armor under his clothes that was completely impenetrable. The Greeks were hacking away at him, and their swords were just bouncing off. He was fighting back, this gold-clad tank of a man, until one soldier realized the trick. He jammed the spike of his spear right through the eye hole of the guy's helmet. The giant finally fell. The death of Mecistius sent a shockwave through the whole Persian army. Their cavalry charged in recklessly just to try and get his body back, leading to a brutal, dusty brawl over the corpse. But the Greeks held their ground. They put the body of the Persian commander on a cart and paraded it through their ranks to show everyone. It was a massive boost for their morale. They had drawn first blood and killed the enemy's favorite son. But Pausanias knew this was just the beginning. Mardonius was watching from the valley floor, and he wasn't smiling anymore. The staring contest was over, and the real war was about to begin. Look, that little high the Greeks got from killing the Persian cavalry commander didn't last long at all. In fact, it vanished about as fast as a drop of water hits a hot stone in the middle of a Greek summer. We are talking about August now. If you've never been to that part of the world in August, let me tell you, the sun isn't just bright. It is a physical weight that hammers down on you. Now imagine standing in that heat while you are wrapped in 60 pounds of solid bronze armor. You are sweating buckets, and dehydration becomes a much faster killer than any Persian arrow could ever be. Pausanias, the guy in charge of the Spartans, looked at his army and realized they were in a real jam. Sure, they were safe from cavalry charges up on that high ground, but they were miles away from any decent water source. Feeling a bit cocky after that small win against Mecistius, Pausanias decided to make a move. He ordered the entire Greek line, we are talking about 100,000 men, to shuffle down from the safety of the hills toward the Asopus River. They settled near a spot called the Gargaphia Spring. At the time it probably felt like a smart move, but man, it really wasn't. Mardonius, the Persian general, was just sitting back and watching them move. He didn't rush in to attack them while they were out in the open. Why would he? He saw exactly what Pausanias had done. The Greeks had just stuck their necks out. They were closer to the enemy now, but more importantly, their supply lines were totally exposed. Those lines stretched all the way back through the mountain passes, and Mardonius knew exactly how to snap them. He snapped his fingers and sent his cavalry out again, but this time they weren't there to fight. They were there to starve the Greeks out. It was a brilliant move. These Persian horsemen circled around the back and hit the mountain passes. They caught a massive convoy of 500 supply wagons bringing food from the Peloponnese. They didn't just take the food, they slaughtered the oxen and the drivers, leaving the Greek army with absolutely nothing to eat. Suddenly, this wasn't a war about who had the sharpest spears. It was about who could go the longest without a meal. For 8 long days, both sides just sat there. The Greeks were terrified to move forward because the open ground was a death sentence against those horses. But they couldn't move back either without looking like a bunch of cowards. So they just sat there, baking in the sun, while Mardonius tightened the rope around their necks. Every single day, the Persian riders would gallop up to the river, shoot thousands of arrows into the Greek ranks, and then just ride away laughing. They were mocking the Spartans, calling them out to come and fight like men, but Pausanias held them back. He relied on that legendary Spartan discipline, refusing to let anyone break formation. But here is the thing, discipline is great, but it doesn't do anything for a dry throat. Then things went from bad to worse. On the 11th day, Mardonius got tired of waiting. He ordered his cavalry to bypass the front line and hit the Greeks where it hurt the most, the Gargaphia Spring. This wasn't a battle, it was straight-up vandalism. The Persian horses trampled the spring, turning the only clean water for miles into a thick, disgusting mess of mud and silt. In just a few hours, the water supply for 100,000 men was gone. Try to picture that. It is getting dark. You haven't had a real meal in days. Your lips are cracked and bleeding from thirst. The spring is ruined, and the enemy cavalry is sitting on the only road home. You are trapped. Panic started to spread through the camp like a wildfire. The leaders of the different Greek cities started bickering. The Athenians wanted to charge, the Corinthians wanted to run, and the Spartans were just standing there like stone walls. Pausanias knew if they stayed one more day, the whole alliance would just fall apart from thirst or a mutiny. He had to make a call, and he chose one of the most dangerous moves in the history of warfare, a tactical retreat in the middle of the night, while the enemy is right in your face. The plan was to wait until the second watch of the night, then have the whole army pack up and pull back to a spot they called the island, which was closer to the mountains and had fresh water. It sounds simple, but it required 100,000 men to be dead silent and move in perfect sync without the Persians hearing a thing only a few hundred yards away. It was a great plan on paper, but as anyone who has ever been in a mess knows, plans are the first thing to break when reality hits. As the sun went down and the moon came up, the Greeks got ready to move. They had no idea they were about to walk into a complete disaster that almost ended Western civilization before it even really started. The moment the signal was given, the whole coalition just disintegrated. The guys in the center of the line, soldiers from Corinth and Megara, didn't just retreat. They panicked and ran. They didn't stop at the agreed spot. They kept running all the way back to the town of Plataea and hid behind a temple. Just like that, in the dark, the Greek army lost half of its men because of pure fear. But over on the right wing with the Spartans, The problem wasn't fear, it was pride. This brings us to a guy named Captain Amompharitus. This man was the definition of stubborn. He was in charge of a prestigious unit, and when the order to retreat came down, he just said, no. He told the supreme commander of all Greece that he wasn't going to bring shame on his country by running away from strangers, which was his polite way of saying the Persians. Imagine this scene. It is 2 o'clock in the morning and pitch black. The rest of the army is trying to sneak away quietly, and here is Pausanias, the big boss, having a screaming match with one of his own captains in the dark. Pausanias was begging him, explaining it wasn't a retreat, just a move. But Amompharitus didn't care about the wording. To a guy raised on the stories of Leonidas, moving backward was a sin. It got so heated that the captain picked up a massive boulder from the riverbed and slammed it down at Pausanias's feet. He yelled, "With this pebble, I'm voting not to run away." While this family drama was going on, the Athenians on the other side of the line were just sitting there confused. They were waiting for the Spartans to move first, but nothing was happening. They sent a runner over to see what the holdup was, and the messenger found the Spartan leaders just shouting at each other while the army stood still. The messenger basically asked, "Hey guys, the sun is coming up. Are we doing this or what?" Pausanias, totally exhausted and furious, finally made a choice. He decided to just leave Amompharitus behind. He ordered the rest of the Spartans to start marching, hoping that once the stubborn captain saw his friends leaving, he'd get over himself and follow. It was a high-stakes game of chicken with thousands of lives on the line. The Spartan column started moving south, but they were dragging their feet and looking back the whole time. And sure enough, when Amompharitus realized he was actually going to be left alone to face 300,000 Persians, he finally cracked and ordered his men to jog and catch up. But it was too late. The sky was turning gray, the birds were starting to sing, and the sun was coming over the mountains. Over in the Persian camp, the guards rubbed their eyes and looked out. The center of the Greek line was gone. The Athenians were miles away, hidden by hills, and right there, totally exposed on the ridges, were the Spartans, all spread out in a messy line with one unit trailing behind like a lost kid. General Mardonius stepped out of his tent and saw the greatest gift the gods could have given him. He didn't see a tactical move. He saw a total rout. He turned to his officers and laughed, mocking the Spartans' reputation. He didn't even wait to get his men in order. He just pointed at those red cloaks and yelled, "Get them!" The sun was finally up over those hills, and with it came the shadow of absolute death. You have to understand, General Mardonius didn't bother sending his foot soldiers in for a fair stand-up fight. He was way too smart for that kind of amateur move. Instead, he ordered tens of thousands of his elite archers to plant their wicker shields deep into the dirt, creating a makeshift wall, and told them to simply darken the sky with arrows. This is the exact moment where the Battle of Plataea stops being a military maneuver and turns into a real-life psychological horror movie. The Spartans and their Tegean allies, we are talking about roughly 53,000 men in total, were stuck out on those open slopes of the Cithæron range. They weren't even in a proper battle formation yet. They had been caught right in the middle of their chaotic night march as the Persian cavalry swarmed around their sides, and those archers started unloading volley after volley into them. Now, most normal people would either charge forward in a panic or turn tail and run for their lives, but Pausanias did neither of those things. He ordered the entire army to halt and drop to one knee. Then, while his men were screaming and dying around him and thousands of arrows were clattering against their bronze shields like hail on a tin roof, Pausanias actually turned his back on the enemy. He called for a priest because he needed to perform a sacrifice. See, in the ancient Greek world, you didn't lift a finger to fight until the gods gave you the green light. They dragged a goat forward right there in the dirt, and Pausanias slit its throat to check the liver for a sign from above. The signs were unpropitious. Basically, the gods said no, so Pausanias just waited. Imagine being a soldier in that line for a second. You're ducking behind your shield, hearing the constant thud, thud, thud of arrows hitting the bronze face. You can hear the guys next to you groaning and gasping as arrows find the gaps in their armor, hitting the neck, the groin, or the unarmored feet. And meanwhile, your general is just staring at a goat's insides, shaking his head. Now, shift your perspective and think about the guy crouching right behind the Spartan. This is a helot, a slave. He doesn't have a big bronze shield. He's got maybe some animal skins or a wicker target. He was dragged here to carry bags and throw rocks for a master who treats him like dirt every other day of the year. But right now, those Persian arrows don't care who is a master and who is a slave. The helots were dying in droves. To them, this wasn't some noble display of Spartan discipline. It was straight-up industrial slaughter. They had to watch their masters stand there like statues, refusing to hit back while the world ended around them. One of the most tragic stories from that morning was about a Spartan named Callicrates. The historian Herodotus tells us he was the most beautiful man in the entire Greek army, a perfect physical specimen. Before the fight even officially kicked off, a Persian arrow caught him right in the side. As he was being carried to the back, dying in total agony, his last words weren't about the pain or his family. He told a friend that he didn't mind dying for Greece, but he was devastated that he had to die without ever landing a single blow or even using his hands to fight back. This went on for what felt like an absolute eternity. They brought up another goat, slit its throat, checked the liver, still bad omens. "Wait," Pausanias said again. The Persian infantry saw they weren't fighting back and started getting brave. They moved within shouting distance, pouring even more fire into the motionless Greek ranks. The Tegeans, the guys on the Spartan flank, finally snapped. They started to shift their weight, ready to charge without any orders because they couldn't take the passive dying anymore. Pausanias just glared at them. He looked up at the temple of Hera on the distant hill, and tears were actually streaming down his face, which is a rare display of emotion for a guy like him. He screamed out a prayer to the goddess, begging her not to let them die in such a shameful way. This was the ultimate test of their tactics. The Greek phalanx is a tank, but its biggest weakness is its rigidity. If they had charged one by one, the cavalry would have just picked them off like a game. By forcing them to sit there and suffer together, Pausanias was keeping that formation tight and unbreakable. Finally, just as the Tegeans were about to lose it and charge anyway, they sacrificed a third goat. Pausanias looked down, and this time the liver was good. The omens had finally shifted. Pausanias stood up. He didn't give a big speech or blow a trumpet. He simply raised his spear. That iron discipline that had kept 10,000 elite men frozen in a literal storm of arrows suddenly let go. The statues came to life. The Spartans didn't just walk, they exploded forward. All that pent-up rage from an hour of watching their friends die without fighting back was about to be dumped right on the Persian line. The waiting was over. The butchery was about to begin. When the two armies finally collided, it wasn't the sound of swords clashing. It was the sickening crunch of wood shattering under the weight of bronze. The Persians had set up that barrier of wicker shields to protect their archers. Against light infantry, those shields were great, but against the charging Spartan phalanx, they might as well have been made of wet paper. When Pausanias lowered his spear, the Spartans surged forward like a dam bursting. They crashed into the Persian line with so much force that the front ranks of the Immortals were physically lifted off their feet and trampled into the dirt. Now the battle entered the phase the Greeks called the otismos, which is basically a giant shoving match. And this is where the technological gap between the East and the West became fatal. The Persians were brave. I want to be very clear about that. They were not cowards. They were grabbing the Spartan spears with their bare hands and snapping the wooden shafts just to try and disarm them. They threw themselves at the wall of shields with daggers and short swords, trying to find any tiny gap. They fought like lions, but courage cannot beat physics. The Persians were wearing linen tunics or scale armor designed to stop arrows, not heavy bronze thrusts. The Spartans, on the other hand, were encased in bronze from their chins down to their knees. When a Persian struck a Spartan, his blade usually just glanced off the shield or the breastplate. When a Spartan struck back, he went through bone. Once the long spears broke, the Spartans drew their short swords, the xiphos, and that is where the real revenge started. They moved with a robotic, industrial efficiency, stab to the face, bash with the shield, step forward over the corpse, and repeat. The helots, who had been dying passively earlier, now swarmed into the gaps. Armed with slings and knives, they finished off any wounded Persians the knights knocked down. It was a total meat grinder. The dust rose so thick you could only fight by sound and silhouette. The screaming was constant, a mix of Persian commands and the guttural roars of Greeks finally letting go of months of frustration. In the middle of all this was Mardonius. Unlike King Xerxes, who watched from a safe throne on a hill, Mardonius was right in the thick of the fight. He sat on a magnificent white horse, surrounded by his elite bodyguard of 1,000 men. He was fighting brilliantly, and his presence was the only thing keeping the Persian army together. As long as they could see that white horse and the general's purple cloak, they fought on, even as they were being slaughtered. But the Spartans saw him too. They realized this wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a headhunting mission. Like a predator smelling blood, the whole Spartan line began to grind its way toward the man on the white horse. They didn't care about the gold or the jewelry on the ground. They wanted the head of the man who burned Athens. The gap between the Spartan front line and General Mardonius's personal bodyguard started to shrink by the second. The Persians were throwing absolutely everything they had into that space to protect their leader. Heaps of bodies, horses, and even furniture they'd dragged out from their camp. But that bronze wall of the Spartan phalanx just kept on coming, step by bloody step. That black sacrifice Pausanias had offered to the gods earlier wasn't a goat anymore. Now, the sacrifice was the Persian army itself. The circle of protection around Mardonius was getting smaller and tighter. Those 1,000 elite Persian guards were dying one by one, and their bodies were literally forming a ramp of flesh that the Spartans started climbing over just to get closer to the prize. This wasn't a standard battle anymore. It had turned into a full-blown assassination attempt carried out by an entire army. History actually remembers the name of the man who finally delivered the blow, Arimnestos. He was a Spartan of huge renown, and his name roughly translates to the one who is remembered. Believe me, on this day he earned that name. Arimnestos spotted Mardonius up on his white horse, rising above the dusty mess like a lighthouse in the middle of a storm. The Persian general was still fighting bravely, cutting down Spartans from his saddle, but bravery is no match for a 20-pound ash spear driven by the muscles of a man who has been training for war since he was 7 years old. Arimnestos lunged forward. Some stories say he used a rock to crush the general's skull, while others say he drove a spear right through his chest. But either way, the result was exactly the same. The supreme commander of the Persian Empire, the cousin of King Xerxes, and the man who burned Athens, was knocked clean off his horse and slammed into the bloody dirt of Boeotia. He didn't get back up. The second Mardonius hit the ground, the entire sound of the battle changed. The roar of the Persian army just faltered. You see, ancient armies were a lot like snakes. If you cut off the head, the rest of the body just twists around and dies. The Immortals, these guys who had never taken a step backward and had terrified the whole world, saw their leader fall and finally broke. They threw down those wicker shields and started running for their lives. But the most cold-blooded moment came from the second in command, a guy named Artabazus. He was sitting there with a reserve force of 40,000 men, plenty of guys to flank the Spartans and maybe even win the whole thing. But Artabazus was a survivor above all else. He watched Mardonius fall from a distance, saw that Spartan machine grinding forward, and he did the math in his head. Instead of charging in to save his people, he turned his horse around and ordered his 40,000 men to march the other way, not back to camp, but straight out of Greece. He completely abandoned the rest of the army to their fate. It was a calculated betrayal that sealed the doom of every single Persian left on that field. The remaining Persians, now leaderless and terrified, just panicked. They didn't even try to retreat in an organized way. They just routed, A chaotic river of people flowed backward toward that great wooden stockade they'd built days before. They scrambled inside the wooden walls, barred the gates, and climbed the towers, hoping those fortifications would be their salvation. They were dead wrong. They had basically just trapped themselves in a cage with a hungry tiger. The Spartans arrived at the walls of the fort shortly after, but here is a surprising fact. Spartans were actually terrible at siege warfare. They were trained to fight in open fields, not to climb up walls. For a while, the Persians managed to hold them off, raining arrows down on the Spartans who were pacing below the walls like a pack of frustrated wolves. It looked like a stalemate, but then the Athenians finally showed up. Remember them? They had been busy fighting the pro-Persian Greeks on the other side of the field, but when they heard the news of the victory, they sprinted over to join the Spartans. And unlike the guys from Sparta, the Athenians were excellent engineers. They knew exactly how to take down a wall. The Athenians breached the stockade, tearing down a whole section of the wooden rampart, and through that hole poured the full, unfiltered fury of the Lacedaemonians. What happened inside that fort wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. This is the part of the Battle of Plataea that the history books usually gloss over because it makes people uncomfortable. The Greeks didn't take prisoners, and they didn't accept any surrenders. They moved through that crowded camp where tens of thousands of Persians were trapped with nowhere to run, and they killed every single thing that moved. It was methodical. All the frustration from the loss at Thermopylae, all the anger over the burning of Athens, and all the misery from those days of thirst, it was all taken out on those trapped men. The ground inside that fort turned into a sludge of mud and blood so deep it reached the soldiers' ankles. Out of the nearly 260,000 Persians who had stayed with Mardonius, the ancient sources claim only 3,000 actually survived the day. Now, those numbers might be a bit exaggerated by the Greek historians, but the archaeological reality is clear. An entire generation of Persian manpower was wiped off the face of the earth in a single afternoon. When the screaming finally stopped, a strange, heavy silence fell over all that carnage. The dust settled on the biggest graveyard the Greek world had ever seen. But as the Spartans and Athenians wiped the blood out of their eyes, they started to realize something else. They weren't just standing in a graveyard, they were standing on a massive fortune. The Persian camp wasn't just a military base, it was a mobile palace. Mardonius had taken over King Xerxes' personal tent when the monarch fled, and he had been living in imperial luxury. We're talking about gold-mixing bowls, silver tables, and tapestries woven with purple dye that was worth more than a soldier's entire life. There were chests overflowing with minted gold coins called darics. For the Greeks, who lived very simple lives, especially the Spartans, whose currency was literally made of heavy iron bars just to stop people from hoarding it, this was like walking into a fever dream. They were staring at more wealth than they could even imagine, and they had no idea that this gold was about to change them forever. Once the blood started to dry in the dirt of Plataea, a strange silence took over the camp. The Greeks had just pulled off the impossible, but they were about to find out that winning a war can be just as dangerous as losing one. There is this one famous story that perfectly captures how weird things got. General Pausanias, still covered in the grime and sweat of the slaughter, walked into the massive silk-lined pavilion that used to belong to Mardonius. He saw the gold furniture and the silver tables, and then he spotted the Persian chefs cowering in the corner. Instead of killing them, Pausanias gave them a bizarre order. He told them to cook a feast exactly like they would have for the Persian general. They went all out, roasting exotic meats, baking fancy breads, and pouring sweet wine into silver platters. Then Pausanias turned to his own Spartan cooks and told them to make a standard Spartan mess. They threw some pork blood, vinegar, and lentils into a pot and boiled it into that infamous black broth, a meal so nasty that people used to say it was the reason Spartans weren't afraid to die. Pausanias sat the two meals side by side, a golden feast on the left and a bowl of brown sludge on the right. He called his officers in, pointed at the luxury, and started laughing. He told them, Look at the folly of these people. They had all of this, yet they came here to rob us, who have nothing." It was a great line, and it became the ultimate piece of propaganda for the West. But here's the kicker. While Pausanias was mocking that gold, something inside him was actually breaking. He was mocking the feast, but he was secretly falling in love with the taste of it. The victory saved Greece, but it absolutely doomed Pausanias. See, the alliance between Sparta and Athens was like a wolf and a shark agreeing to hunt together. The second the prey was dead, they started looking at each other with suspicion. Athens went home, rebuilt their walls, and started building an empire of their own. But Pausanias, he went off the deep end. Reports started filtering back to Sparta that their hero wasn't acting like a Spartan anymore. He stopped wearing the rough red cloak of his people and started walking around in long purple Persian robes. He stopped eating the black broth and started throwing massive, expensive banquets. He even hired a private bodyguard of foreigners so his fellow Greeks couldn't get close to him. It was a total scandal. Rumors were flying that he was writing secret letters to King Xerxes, offering to hand over all of Greece if the king would let him marry his daughter. The Spartans recalled him and put him on trial, but he managed to walk free because they didn't have enough hard proof. But Pausanias didn't take the hint. He allegedly started trying to stir up a revolt among the Helots, the very slaves he had led at Plataea. To the Spartan leaders, that was the final straw. They set a trap, got a servant to overhear his treason, and the hunt was on. The greatest general in the world was now a wanted man in his own streets. Pausanias made a desperate run for it and ducked into the temple of Athena, claiming sanctuary. Now, in the ancient world, you couldn't kill a man inside a temple without cursed luck from the gods. The Spartan leaders arrived at the doors and stopped. They couldn't go in, and they couldn't drag him out, so they came up with a cold-blooded Spartan solution. They decided to brick up the doors so he could never leave, and this is the detail that really hits you. As the men were gathering stones to seal him inside, an old woman walked up to the threshold. It was Pausanias's own mother. She didn't say a word, and she didn't cry. She just picked up a heavy stone, placed it right in front of the door, and walked away. She was voting for her son's death to save the honor of her city. Pausanias sat in the pitch black of that temple for days, with no food and no water. Just as he was about to draw his last breath, the leaders dragged his starving, emaciated body out into the sunlight so he wouldn't pollute the holy ground by dying inside. He died a prisoner and a disgrace. This is exactly why nobody makes big Hollywood movies about the Battle of Plataea. It's messy. The hero turns into a villain, and the good guys commit war crimes. People prefer the clean story of Thermopylae, where the 300 die noble deaths before they have a chance to get corrupted. We like the martyr Leonidas more than the conqueror Pausanias, but don't get it twisted. Thermopylae was just a symbol. Plataea was the salvation. It was on those dusty, bloody plains that 10,000 Spartans and their allies looked the end of the world in the eye and didn't blink. They proved that free people could break a superpower. It was brutal, it was savage, and it was the only way they were going to survive. So next time you hear someone talking about the 300 Spartans, do me a favor. Remind them about the 10,000 who came later to finish the job. Remember the vengeance, remember the win, and never forget the price they paid for it.